I stood in the doorway, the stale scent of damp carpet and leftover paint wrapping around me like a warning. "It's not a nursing home," my daughter said with a smile too sharp to be kind. "You should be grateful. Grateful. For the basement. For being pushed beneath the life I built. After years of sacrifice, of signing every mortgage check, of raising her under this very roof, I was now something to be stored, not seen. All right. Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." Elaine stood in the doorway, her fingers lightly brushing the frame, her eyes locked on the space before her. The basement, once just a forgotten corner of the house, had been transformed, or rather, repurposed. The walls, once plain and neutral, now wore a drab coat of beige paint, and in the far corner, a mismatched array of second-hand furniture sat like it had been plucked from an old retirement home. The smell of must and old upholstery hung in the air. Jessica stood beside her, arms crossed and a smug expression curling on her lips. "Here it is," she said, her voice too cheerful, too forced. "The perfect space for you. We've cleaned it up, got some furniture. Should be just fine, don't you think?" Elaine's heart sank. It wasn't the furniture, it wasn't the dim lighting, it was the feeling of being pushed into a corner, a place she didn't belong. She had spent decades in this house, raising Jessica, making memories, but now her daughter was offering her this, what, a dungeon? She swallowed hard, the knot in her throat growing tighter. "You should just be grateful you're not in a nursing home," Jessica added with a sneer, her tone sharp like a blade. Elaine's chest tightened at the words, but she said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them together, forcing herself to keep her composure. This was not the first time Jessica had spoken to her like this, but this time, it was different. This time, Elaine would not be pushed into silence. Brad, lounging in the far corner with a beer in his hand, didn't look up from the screen of his phone. He shrugged nonchalantly. "Yeah, it's better than the alternative, right?" Elaine's gaze flickered over to him. There he was again. The same tired face, the same lack of interest, always siding with Jessica. She could feel the weight of his indifference pressing down on her. She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, her anger bubbling beneath the surface. But she kept it in check. She had learned long ago that a quiet storm was more dangerous than any outburst. She nodded slowly, trying to mask the burn in her chest, and stepped farther into the room, her eyes tracing over the furniture as if it were a distant memory she didn't want to recall. She needed to keep her calm, for now. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice softer than she intended. Jessica's smile stretched wider, almost as if she could sense the tension Elaine was holding back. "We'll get you settled down here, Mom. You'll be fine. It's cozy." Elaine didn't respond. She just stood there, her back stiff, her mind racing. This wasn't just about the basement or the furniture. This was about control, about how Jessica thought she had the right to decide what Elaine's life should be. The weight of it pressed on her chest, suffocating, but Elaine knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to be trapped in this house, in this life, any longer. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. A welcome distraction. "Guess who's here?" Jessica said, a little too cheerfully, stepping back toward the stairs. "It's Marion." Elaine exhaled softly, the tightness in her chest easing just a little. Marion, her best friend, the one person who still saw her as more than a guest in her own home. She forced a smile, grateful for the company. Later, as the door swung open, Elaine's heart dropped again. Marion stood there, her eyes scanning Elaine's face with a practiced eye. "Elaine?" Marion's voice was soft, but sharp with concern. She stepped inside, her eyes immediately going to the basement door. "I heard the news. How are you holding up?" Elaine didn't speak immediately, the weight of the moment too much. She took a step back, letting Marion in, before collapsing on the couch. The tears she had been holding back all day finally fell, slipping down her cheeks. Marion stood there for a moment, quiet, before sitting beside her. She didn't ask why. She just pulled Elaine into a hug, her arm around her, comforting her without a word. "It's okay, honey," Marion whispered. "You're not alone in this. Not anymore." Elaine sniffed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "They think I'm trapped," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the deed's in my name. They've forgotten who really owns this house." Marion pulled back just enough to look at her, her sharp eyes full of understanding. She knew. You've been silent long enough. It's time for them to learn the truth. Elaine's lips curled into a faint, determined smile. The truth. The deed. Her home. It was time to take back control. The faintest smell of lavender and dust lingered in the air as Elaine opened the old wooden cabinet. It had once been her husband's. Small, unassuming, yet sturdy. She ran her fingers over the surface, grazing the delicate carvings of flowers and birds. The memory of their shared life together came rushing back, each curve a trace of the past. She swallowed, willing herself not to falter, and pulled out the lockbox hidden behind stacks of old letters and papers. She placed it on the kitchen table, the weight of it more than just physical. The box had been there for years, its contents untouched, waiting for a moment like this. Marian had barely spoken since Elaine had opened the door to the lockbox, but now she leaned in, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "You kept this safe, I see," Marian remarked, the weight of her words not lost on Elaine. Elaine nodded quietly. The lockbox wasn't just for the papers. It was a symbol of everything she had worked for. The home she had built with her own hands, the memories, the life she had lived. She twisted the key, the small click echoing in the silence, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, nestled between old bank statements and receipts, was the property deed, yellowing with age but unmistakably clear. The deed to her home. She passed it over to Marian, whose hands immediately went to the document, flipping it open with precision. Her lips moved silently, reading the text before she looked up. "Your name only," she confirmed, her voice carrying an unexpected weight. Elaine sat down beside her, her hands folding in her lap. "They think this house is theirs," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They've forgotten whose pen signed it." The words echoed in the air like a subtle warning. Marian's gaze softened, but there was something behind her eyes now, a flicker of something sharp, something calculating. Well, it's time they remembered. Elaine allowed herself a slow breath. A rush of relief washed over her. This was the first step. The house was hers, legally, but it wasn't enough just to have the deed. She needed action. She needed someone who could help her make a clean break. Marian set the deed down on the table and slid it toward Elaine. "I've been thinking," she said, leaning back in her chair. "I know someone who can help. Dean Whitmore. He's an estate attorney, but he's more than that. He's someone who doesn't just play by the rules. He knows how to make the rules work for him." Elaine's brow furrowed as she looked at her old friend. "I need to be careful. This could get ugly." Marian's lips twisted into a sly smile. "Ugly is just the beginning. But Dean knows how to deal with people who think they can take advantage, and when it comes to property law, he's the best." Elaine thought for a moment, turning the idea over in her mind. Could she trust this Dean Whitmore? Would he understand the full weight of what she wanted to do? The idea of moving forward, of reclaiming her life, was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I'll call him," Marian said, breaking the silence. "We'll meet him tomorrow." The next day, they sat in a sleek, glass-walled office, the kind that screamed success. Dean Whitmore was a man who wore his wealth and status like a second skin, but there was something about him that made Elaine feel at ease. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the sleek, polished environment around them. Dean leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his gaze studying Elaine carefully. "So, you want out?" His voice was low, measured, with just a touch of amusement. "Let's make them the guests." Elaine's heart skipped a beat, but she held his gaze, not allowing herself to flinch. "No," she said, her voice steady. "Let's make them homeless." The words hung in the air, hanging heavy with promise. Dean didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, the kind of smile that only those who had seen the underbelly of human nature could understand. "I like your style," he said softly, his eyes gleaming with quiet approval. "This won't be easy, but it can be done. You've already got the power. Now we just need to make it official." Elaine felt a rush of something, satisfaction, relief, maybe even triumph. She had taken the first step. It wasn't just about the deed, it was about more than that. It was about regaining control of her life, of her home, and of her future. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was a force to be reckoned with. As she left the office with Marian, her mind was already turning over the possibilities. The pieces were falling into place, and there was no going back. Elaine had made her decision, and there was no turning around now. The door to the elevator closed behind them, and Marion gave Elaine a knowing look. "You're sure about this?" she asked quietly. Elaine's lips curled into a faint smile. "More than ever." They didn't speak again as the elevator descended, but for the first time in years, Elaine felt the weight of her choices in the best possible way. The future was hers to shape, and it was already beginning to take form. The quiet hum of the elevator was the only sound as it moved steadily down, but inside, Elaine felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. She was taking control. The moment of reckoning was coming, and this time, she wouldn't be the one who was trapped. The house hummed with the kind of energy that only a full dinner party could produce. The clink of silverware, the murmur of voices, the laughter that spilled across the room like wine from a glass. The neighbors, all smiles and charm, were seated at the dining table, sipping wine and nodding along to Jessica's animated tales of her perfect life. They fawned over the house, oblivious to the silent tension simmering just beneath the surface. Elaine sat quietly in the corner, picking at her salad, the fork moving in slow, deliberate motion. The food was unimportant. The conversation, however, felt like a slow suffocation. Jessica, radiant as ever, kept gesturing to the walls, the furniture, the meticulously manicured lawn, as if she were giving a tour of some great estate. "This is where we'll probably put the guest room," Jessica said, smiling smugly as she leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the room, knowing full well she had an audience. "Honestly, I can't believe we've lived here for almost a decade. It's perfect for raising kids, if we ever get around to it." She laughed, but it felt hollow, more like a rehearsed line than a genuine chuckle. Elaine's fingers gripped the key edge of her plate just tightly enough to feel the ridges of the porcelain. She forced herself to take another bite, chewing slowly as the words continued to ring in her ears. The neighbors nodded, eyes wide, clearly impressed. Jessica's sense of superiority was undeniable. Her smugness made Elaine's blood boil, but she didn't allow herself to show it. Not yet. Brad, slouched in his chair with a beer in hand, was more interested in his phone than the conversation, but every now and then he'd join in with his customary air of lazy indifference. "You know," he said, raising his bottle with a grin, "we were thinking of turning the basement into a permanent granny suite for Elaine." He laughed lightly, as if it were the punchline of some private joke. Elaine's grip tightened around her fork, the silver glinting under the dim lights. She could feel the weight of their words, their assumption, a granny suite. The term sat like an insult on the tip of her tongue, as if she were some afterthought, some inconvenience to be tucked away and forgotten. But she didn't react. She didn't let them see the storm churning within her. Instead, she kept her expression unreadable, as she always had, a mask of calm, even as her mind worked furiously behind her eyes. Jessica's voice sliced through the silence again. "I told her it'd be great, don't you think? A little retreat of her own down there. We'll even set up a few more chairs, get some nicer things." She waved her hand dismissively, her gaze flicking to Elaine. "It's not like she's getting any younger. It's the best we can do." Elaine wanted to snap, to scream, to tell them exactly what she thought of their plans for her. But she held her tongue. Not yet. It wasn't time. Instead, she glanced down at her phone, the faintest buzz vibrating through her fingers. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a text from Marion. "Marion, paperwork ready when you are." Elaine's pulse quickened. The plan was set. The time was drawing near. She forced her breath to steady, the sharp tang of anticipation prickling her skin. She stared at the message for a moment longer than necessary, then slid her phone back into her lap, pretending she hadn't seen it. She had to remain calm, patient, and above all, she had to play the part. Jessica caught her eye, her gaze filled with barely concealed disdain. "You okay, Mom? You look a little tired." Elaine smiled, her lips thin, the curve more of a reflex than a real expression. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "Just a long day?" Jessica nodded, barely acknowledging the response, already turning back to the neighbors with a new story about her latest business venture. Her words blurred in the background, her voice nothing more than a constant drone. Elaine didn't hear any of it. Instead, she focused on the weight in her chest, the fire that had begun to burn deeper with each passing minute. The deed was in her hands. The house was still hers, but it wouldn't be for long. Excusing herself from the table, Elaine stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. I think I'll go lie down for a while, she said, the words slipping from her mouth like silk over steel. Just need a little rest. Jessica didn't seem to care enough to offer more than a cursory glance. All right, Mom. Don't stay down there too long, okay? The night's just getting started. Elaine nodded, giving her daughter a thin smile as she turned to leave. Her feet took her slowly up the stairs, and each step felt heavier than the last. She didn't look back as she moved through the house, passing the hallway, gliding past the family room where Brad now snored lightly, a bottle of beer still clutched in his hand. She entered her bedroom, the space that was still hers for now, and closed the door with a soft click. She stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, gathering herself. She pulled out her phone again, her fingers moving quickly as she typed a response to Marion. Elaine, I'm ready. Then, with a final glance at the walls that had witnessed so much of her life, she left the room. The plan was in motion, the pieces were falling into place. It was only a matter of time now. The morning air was crisp, the kind that hinted at the first breath of autumn. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Elaine stood by the window, watching the sun climb over the rooftops. Her fingers twitched with anticipation, the weight of her decision settling in her bones. Today, everything would change. Marion had done her part. The house was officially listed, a few quiet clicks and a signature on a couple of forms, and now the deed had morphed into something more. It was on the market, ready to be sold, ready to slip from their grasp. Elaine's phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her reverie. She picked it up, her heart racing. Marion, it's live, showings today. Elaine's lips curled into a tight smile. The first steps were always the hardest, but there was no turning back now. By the time Jessica left for work that afternoon, Elaine was already preparing the house for the first round of discreet showings. She moved through the rooms, making sure everything was in place, but the effort felt hollow. The house, once filled with memories, now seemed to hum with a different kind of energy, a quiet, almost predatory stillness. It was no longer her house, but it was still hers for now. Her phone buzzed again. Dean. She opened the message. Dean. Pre-qualifications are secured. The offers will start rolling in. Elaine's pulse quickened. Everything was falling into place. The plan was moving forward, one piece at a time. Later that day, a car rolled up to the curb. A sleek, dark sedan that looked out of place in the quiet neighborhood. Elaine caught a glimpse through the window, her heart hammering in her chest as she saw the first potential buyers step out. There was no time for hesitation. She had to stay calm. The front door opened with a creak as Elaine stepped into the entryway, her movements slow and deliberate. The buyers, a young couple, eyed the house with interest as they made their way inside. Elaine greeted them with a smile, keeping her voice steady. "We're just doing a little inspection," she said smoothly, her tone casual but carefully measured. "Repairs and upkeep, things like that." The couple nodded, glancing around the entryway, their expressions unreadable. They looked as if they might ask questions, but they didn't. Elaine led them from room to room, showing them the layout and pretending to be nothing more than a caretaker of the space. She kept one eye on the front yard, where a moving van was parked, silently waiting for the moment when the buyers would leave. It wouldn't be long. They weren't here to fall in love with the house. They were just part of the charade. As they moved through the living room, the man, a tall, clean-cut figure, stopped to examine the fireplace. He looked at Elaine. "What kind of repairs are you talking about exactly?" Elaine smiled politely, masking the sharp edge of her words. "Oh, just some minor things, nothing that would affect the value. We're just making sure everything's in good shape. You know how it is." Brad, who had been lounging on the couch, suddenly sat up, his lazy expression shifting into something more curious. He peered over at the young couple, then at Elaine, his voice dripping with confusion. "You're selling?" His gaze flickered over the buyers, suspicion creeping into his tone. "You didn't tell me about that." Elaine's heart skipped a beat. Her instincts told her to pause, to think carefully. She plastered a serene smile on her face, even as she felt her stomach tighten. "Just making sure everything's in order," she said, turning her back to Brad. "Don't worry, it's all part of the plan." Brad narrowed his eyes, but Elaine was already on the move, making her way toward the kitchen with the buyers in tow, pretending to fiddle with the cabinets. "Could you go pick up the dry cleaning for me?" Elaine asked sweetly, her voice laced with just the right amount of sweetness. "I'll take care of everything here." Brad looked torn for a moment, but then shrugged and grabbed his jacket. Elaine knew he would be gone for at least an hour. That was all she needed. As the couple left, their footsteps echoing in the hallway, Elaine allowed herself a deep breath of relief. She could hear the sound of the moving truck outside now, the creak of its heavy wheels as the workers moved in and out of the house. She exchanged a quick look with the buyers before they disappeared, nodding to each other in silent agreement. The house was no longer just a home, it was a commodity, a piece of property, a transaction, waiting to happen. Elaine stepped outside for a moment, allowing the cool air to hit her face. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed a quick message to Marion. Elaine. It started. They're in the house. The clock is ticking. She looked at the house, once filled with life, with memories of her family, her daughter. Now it was a ticking time bomb, waiting to go off. As the moving truck rumbled in the background, Elaine couldn't help but whisper to herself, a quiet truth she had been carrying for too long. This house has been theirs in their heads for too long. Elaine sat by the window, staring out at the street where the moving truck had once parked. The hum of the quiet neighborhood felt foreign now, like it belonged to someone else. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was an email, subject line in bold, full price cash offer, ready to close. Her breath caught in her chest as she opened the message. The numbers on the screen were clear. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just an offer. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The house was as good as sold. Her fingers hovered over the phone, almost as if she could will the sale to be final with just a touch. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself a quiet, stolen victory. It was done. The house would soon belong to someone else, someone who wasn't tied to the past, someone who would see it for what it truly was, just a property, no strings attached. Moments later, the sound of the doorbell broke the stillness, snapping Elaine back to the present. Marion stood in the doorway, her face alight with both concern and exhilaration. She stepped inside, locking eyes with Elaine. "You got the offer?" Marion asked, her voice full of knowing. Elaine nodded, her lips tight with the weight of what was about to happen. She handed Marion her phone, letting her read the email for herself. Marion's eyes scanned the details, then met Elaine's gaze. Full price, and all cash. She smiled, but it was more than a smile. It was the smile of someone who knew how far Elaine had come to get here. This is it. This is really happening. Elaine allowed herself a quiet breath, then placed her phone down on the table. She felt the urge to do something, anything, but instead, she remained still, watching as Marion took a step closer, wrapping her arms around her in a quick, tight hug. "You did it," she whispered. "This is going to be brutal." Elaine chuckled softly, pulling back just enough to meet her friend's eyes. "I know, but they deserve it." The next few days felt like an eternal slow march to the inevitable. The paperwork was drawn up. Dean had been thorough, drafting an ironclad contract that would stand up to any challenge. Elaine had read every line, signed with a sense of finality that made her feel lighter, even as the weight of the moment pressed down. Finally, the day arrived. The for sale pending sign was placed in the front yard, its bright red letters visible from the street. Elaine felt a ripple of satisfaction as she gazed at it from the window. The endgame was in sight. She was preparing for a quiet evening when she heard the unmistakable sound of Jessica's car pulling into the driveway. Her pulse quickened, the anticipation settling deep in her gut. It wouldn't be long now. Jessica stormed in, her face flushed with rage, her eyes locked on the yard before flicking to Elaine with the force of a weapon. "What the hell is this?" she spat, pointing to the for sale pending sign outside. "You didn't say anything about selling. You didn't tell me this was happening." Elaine didn't flinch. Instead, she remained seated at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap. "You never asked," she said quietly, her voice steady. Jessica's face twisted with fury. "This house isn't yours to sell," she screamed, her voice rising in desperation. "It's mine too. You can't just do this." Elaine's gaze never wavered. "It was never yours?" she said, her voice calm but unyielding. The words felt like a balm on a wound that had been festering for years. "This house has always been mine. The deed is in my name. Not yours. Not Brad's. Mine." Jessica's eyes widened, her breath coming in sharp, angry gasps. "You can't just throw us out like this. This is..." This is our home. Elaine shook her head, the edges of her lips curling into a faint but resolute smile. It was never yours, Jessica. Not really. You've taken everything you wanted, and now it's time for me to take what's mine. She stood slowly, her posture straightening, her voice a low, unshakable promise. I've lived in this house long enough to know that no one can ever take it from me. Not you, not anyone. Jessica's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white. Brad appeared in the doorway, still dazed from whatever stupor he had been in, but the reality of the situation hit him like a cold wave. He blinked, then glanced at the sign outside and back at Elaine, a twinge of disbelief creeping across his face. You can't do this, Brad blurted out, his voice full of shock. We're family. You can't just kick us out like this. Elaine turned to him, her expression unreadable. You've always been a guest here, Brad. And guests don't get to decide anything. Not anymore. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Jessica's breath came in uneven bursts, her lips trembling with barely contained anger. But Elaine's words had struck true. There was no turning back now. As Elaine stood there, watching the house she had built unravel before her eyes, she felt something new stirring deep within her, a sense of freedom. The battle was won. The future was hers. And she had taken back everything they had tried to steal. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the front door, leaving Jessica and Brad to face the truth. The house was hers again. The only question left was who would be the last one standing. The morning air had taken on a new chill, but the heat inside the courtroom was palpable. Elaine sat, calm and poised, her fingers lightly clasped together in her lap. Her eyes stayed on the front, on the judge who had yet to make a ruling, but who she knew would soon confirm what she already knew. This was her victory. She didn't need the approval of anyone, least of all Jessica. Across the room, Jessica fidgeted in her seat, a legal document clutched in her hand, her eyes darting back and forth between Elaine and the opposing counsel. Brad sat beside her, looking less like her husband and more like an accomplice who'd just been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Elaine could almost hear their thoughts. How had this all gone so wrong? But she didn't care about their thoughts. She didn't care about anything except what was about to happen. Jessica had filed an emergency injunction just days before, a last-ditch effort to stop the sale. She had pulled every string she could, from frantic calls to lawyers to threats veiled in desperation. She claimed the sale was illegal, that Elaine was doing something underhanded, that the house, as a family home, was meant to be passed down. Elaine couldn't help but smirk at the absurdity. The house had always been hers. The deed was in her name, not Jessica's, not Brad's. But Jessica wasn't going down without a fight, and that made her even more dangerous. Your Honor, the lawyer for Jessica began, his voice trying to sound composed but faltering with the tension in the room. We respectfully request an emergency injunction. The sale of this property must be halted immediately. The house was, he glanced at Jessica, who was biting her lip, was intended to stay within the family. Elaine's attorney, Dean Whitmore, rose to his feet, his demeanor calm but cutting. He held up the documents and spoke with quiet authority. Your Honor, I present the deed and the tax history of this property. You'll notice, as the records clearly show, that the house has always been in Miss Porter's name. There is no claim by anyone else, not by her daughter, nor by her son-in-law. The sale is entirely legal, and the request for an injunction is baseless. Elaine watched as the judge flipped through the pages Dean presented. He looked up after a few moments, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. I'll tell you what I think, Ms. Porter's lawyer, the judge said, his voice dry, almost amused. This is an open and shut case. The deed is clear. The tax history is clear. The house is hers. She has the right to do as she pleases with it. He set the papers down with a finality that made Jessica's face blanch. He turned to Jessica's lawyer. I'm afraid the injunction is denied. You have no legal grounds to stop the sale. He paused, glancing briefly at Jessica before adding, this is not a case of family inheritance. It's a case of legal ownership. Jessica's face turned red, her hands tightening into fists. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it, silenced by the finality of the ruling. Brad slumped in his chair, looking thoroughly defeated. The weight of the judge's decision hung in the air like a palpable fog, thick with the knowledge that their attempt to retain control had been crushed. Dean stepped forward, his voice smooth. Your Honor? I also request a ruling on the timeline for the sale. Ms. Porter is prepared to proceed immediately. The judge nodded, jotting a few notes. The sale will proceed as scheduled. Ms. Porter has the full right to sell this property. There's nothing more to discuss. As the court session adjourned, Elaine stood slowly, her movements graceful, controlled. Her heart didn't race. It simply fluttered with the knowledge that her path was clear. She had won. Jessica's eyes burned with a mixture of disbelief and rage as she shot to her feet, storming out of the courtroom without another word. Brad followed behind her, casting a glance at Elaine that spoke volumes. Surprise, maybe even a sliver of grudging respect, but mostly confusion. As Elaine made her way toward the exit, she felt a familiar presence behind her. Marion had been sitting quietly at the back, watching the entire ordeal unfold. She fell into step beside her. That was brutal, Marion said, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. But it's over now. Elaine didn't respond right away. She only nodded, taking in the relief that had begun to settle in her chest. Mercy ran out when she shoved you downstairs, Marion added, her voice dry with the same quiet satisfaction that Elaine was now feeling. Elaine's lips curled, slightly. She thought she could push me around, control me, but she didn't realize I had control all along. I was never really trapped in the basement, Marion. I was just waiting for the right moment. Marion chuckled softly, then turned to Elaine. And now, it's yours. All of it. Elaine glanced over at the courthouse steps as they walked toward the car, the weight of everything shifting again. The fight was over. The house was hers to do with as she pleased. But more than that, it was a victory that extended far beyond property or a mere transaction. As they reached the car, Elaine paused, looking back toward the courthouse. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely untethered, free from the past. Time for a fresh start, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. The door closed behind her. The future was waiting. The house was eerily quiet, save for the steady shuffle of boxes being stacked, taped, and loaded into the waiting truck. It was like watching a home being erased, every item picked up and labeled, every inch of space stripped bare. Elaine's heart beat steadily, her movements deliberate, as she moved from room to room, packing up her life. The weight of everything she'd fought for, the years of sacrifice and quiet suffering, felt lighter now with every item she put away. But it wasn't just her things being packed. This was the final dismantling of a life she had never fully lived. In the living room, Jessica and Brad moved frantically, their eyes wide with desperation as they moved their belongings to the far corners of the house, pretending as though this was just another weekend cleaning session. It was all an act, a performance in front of movers who had no interest in their emotional theatrics. I can't believe this is happening, Jessica muttered, a tremor in her voice. She glanced toward Elaine, whose expression remained unreadable. You're really doing this, aren't you? Throwing us out without a second thought. Elaine paused, her gaze fixed on her daughter, who looked smaller than she had before. The years of entitlement, of unspoken assumption, were crumbling before her. Jessica was no longer the daughter who had once run the house with laughter and careless authority. Now she was just a woman scrambling to hang on to whatever was left. Elaine's voice was calm, measured, but the words sliced through the air like a knife. The basement's empty now. So's your claim. Jessica's face flushed with a mixture of disbelief and fury. She took a step forward, as if to protest, but the sound of the movers carrying boxes out of the room stopped her. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, her anger curling like smoke, but she had no words left to fight with. Brad, who had been lurking in the hallway, his hands stuffed in his pockets, let out a nervous laugh. You can't do this, Elaine. This is our house too. You can't just push us out and leave us with nothing. Elaine met his eyes, her gaze steady, unwavering. You were never meant to stay here, Brad. You were always a guest, and guests don't decide anything. Not in my home. Brad's face hardened, but he said nothing, just watching as the movers came in and out, one after another, moving everything but the walls. He knew, deep down, that there was nothing more to say. Elaine had the deed, and with it, the power to end this charade. The house was slipping through his fingers, and there was no amount of stalling that would change that. Jessica, still refusing to accept what was happening, dropped to her knees beside the old family photos that had been left on the mantelpiece. She pulled one out, tears starting to blur her vision. This was supposed to be our home, Elaine. You can't just sell it like it's nothing. Elaine watched her daughter for a long moment, her heart aching in the quietest, most painful way. But she didn't move. It never was yours. Not really. You never understood what it meant to be here. This house was never a symbol of your control. It was mine. Always. Jessica looked up, her face wet with tears, her voice breaking. You can't just throw us out. This is where we belong. But Elaine didn't flinch. She kept her distance, the years of anger, disappointment, and confusion boiling under the surface. No one gets to belong here anymore, Jessica, she said, her voice low but unwavering. The only thing left is for you to move on. Marian stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She'd been watching from the sideline, supervising the movers with a quiet kind of amusement. She was enjoying every minute of this, every small victory that came with watching Elaine take back control. She caught Elaine's eye, nodding in approval. You've earned this, Elaine, she said, her voice full of quiet admiration. It's over. Elaine didn't respond at first. She just watched as Jessica and Brad continued to scramble, helpless in the face of their impending eviction. The movers were almost done, the house nearly empty of the life that had once filled it, the remnants of a home now reduced to mere possession. The finality of it was suffocating, but Elaine could breathe. The last box was wheeled out of the living room, and the front door closed with a soft click. It was done. Dean's voice crackled over the phone, interrupting the silence that had settled over the house. Elaine stepped into the corner of the room to answer. The closing date is finalized, Dean said, his voice calm and professional. We're good to go. The buyers are ready. It's happening. Elaine's chest tightened, but she allowed herself a small smile. Thank you, Dean. This is it then. It's all yours, he replied, his tone confirming everything Elaine had fought for. She hung up, looking around the empty house one last time, the house that had once been the site of so many memories, both painful and beautiful, was now no more than an empty shell. And with it, the final chapter of her old life had closed. But as she stood there, in the stillness, Elaine realized something. The house had never defined her. She had always defined the house. She turned to Marian, her face lit with quiet satisfaction. It's done, she said simply. Marian grinned. It's only just begun. As they walked toward the door, the last echoes of a life once lived fading into the past, Elaine felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The future was finally hers. The finality of it all seemed to settle over Elaine like a heavy blanket. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden light through the window as she sat at the conference table, Dean and Marian at her sides. The hum of the office felt distant, muted by the overwhelming weight of the moment. This was it. The moment she'd worked toward for so long. The moment she could finally close the door on a life that had never truly been hers. Dean's voice was steady as he went over the last few details. The buyers are waiting. The contract is ready for you to sign. His calm demeanor didn't hide the small gleam in his eyes, a hint of satisfaction in the way he spoke. Elaine didn't blame him. He had been the one who had made sure this entire process stayed above board. He had been her advocate when no one else had. Elaine nodded, her hand moving to the pen in front of her. The signature was nothing, just a few strokes of the pen, but it felt like the moment her entire life had led up to. Her eyes stayed on the document, but her mind drifted for a second, remembering the way the house had looked when it was still filled with the noise of Jessica and Brad's careless chatter, the smell of cooking dinners and late-night conversation. That was over now. This house, this piece of property, would belong to someone else. The past, with all its ghosts, would be gone, as if it had never existed. With a steady hand, she signed. The weight of the pen on the paper felt symbolic, heavy and final. Marian leaned over and gave her a light pat on the back. It's done, she said, her voice full of approval. Elaine gave her a small, tired smile, then turned to Dean. Everything's good then. All set, Dean replied. The funds will be wired over to your account within the hour. The house is theirs now. Elaine felt a strange calm settle over her, even though her heart seemed to thrum in her chest. She wasn't nervous, but there was something about this last step, the one that would seal the deal, that felt almost surreal. She had fought so hard to get to this point, and now it was here. The door was closing, and a new chapter was beginning. When they arrived back at the house, The moving trucks were already parked in the driveway. Elaine had expected this. She knew the buyers were eager to take possession of the house, but there was something about seeing it happen in real time that hit her like a wave. From across the street, she could see Jessica standing in the front yard, her hands on her hips, staring at the moving trucks with wide, frantic eyes. She was shaking her head, her face flushed with a combination of disbelief and fury. Elaine could hear her even from the distance, though the words were indistinguishable. Brad was nowhere to be seen, but Elaine didn't care. She wasn't interested in whatever excuses he might offer. He had always been the bystander in all of this, too passive to ever make a real stand. Jessica, on the other hand, was the one who had thought she could control everything. And now, she was learning the hard way that the rules had changed. Elaine walked toward the front door, her steps deliberate, as if each one was its own quiet victory. Marian, walking beside her, gave her a small, knowing glance, her lips twitching with the beginnings of a grin. As Elaine reached the front door, she glanced over at Jessica, who had now stormed up to the moving truck, shouting something unintelligible. It didn't matter. It was over. Elaine! Jessica's voice cracked through the air, filled with desperation. You can't just do this. You can't take everything away from us. Elaine paused at the door for a moment, her back to Jessica. She felt a rush of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Relief. You had your chance, she said, her voice calm but laced with the quiet finality of someone who had fought long enough to know that the battle was won. But you never understood what it meant to be here. Marian gave her a little push, urging her inside. Let's finish this. Elaine stepped over the threshold one last time, closing the door gently behind her. It clicked shut, the sound hollow and final. Back inside, the house was eerily silent. The furniture that had once been a part of their home was gone, replaced by empty space and dust motes drifting lazily through the air. It was almost peaceful in its emptiness, the kind of quiet that followed the end of a storm. As she moved through the rooms, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It was over. She had taken back what was hers. Dean's voice came through her phone, interrupting the stillness. The funds are wired, he said simply. The transaction is complete. Elaine's lips curved into a faint smile. She didn't need to hear anything more. The house was no longer hers in any real way. It was a transaction, a business deal that had been closed. But even as she stood there, alone in the house that had once been her life, she knew that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The door was locked, but not just the house. Everything that had ever bound her to this life, to this place, was now sealed shut. The past was behind her, and whatever came next, she was ready. The sun was setting on another perfect Denver day, casting warm golden light through the large windows of Elaine's new condo. She stood in the middle of the living room, arms crossed, taking in the space. It was smaller than the house, but there was something about it, something that felt entirely hers. The clean, polished surfaces reflected the promise of a fresh start. There were no remnants of the past here, no ghostly echoes of Jessica's tantrums, no reminders of the basement or the years spent silenced under the weight of control. It was just hers. The keys, dangling from the sleek silver keychain in her hand, glinted in the light. She had bought the condo with cash. No mortgage, no debt, no strings. The freedom she had fought so hard to claim was now hers in the most tangible way possible. The weight of the keys in her hand felt more significant than the size of the place. It was a symbol, a testament to her resilience. Elaine turned as Marian entered the condo, carrying a box of decorative items she had brought over to help her settle in. Marian's eyes sparkled with excitement. "This place is perfect for you, Elaine. It's got a fresh energy." Elaine smiled faintly, moving to the small kitchen counter to unpack a few mugs. "It feels right," she said softly. "No basements here." Marian laughed. "No basements, no baseless accusations either." The two of them moved through the space, placing trinkets, hanging up small framed photos, and setting up the furniture. Elaine felt a kind of peace settle within her as the condo began to take shape around her. It was a new home, in every sense of the word. A place where she could finally breathe without the suffocating weight of the past. Back in the house that had once been hers, Jessica had already tried to contact her twice. Her phone buzzed with missed calls and frantic texts. Elaine glanced at the phone once, then tapped the screen to block her daughter's number without hesitation. The decision came without any guilt, as sharp and clean as a freshly cut diamond. It wasn't cruelty, it was protection. Elaine had given Jessica every opportunity to respect boundaries, and Jessica had ignored them at every turn. The past few weeks had proven that there was no fixing what had been broken between them. Elaine's own survival had become more important than holding on to a fading illusion of family. The phone rang again, this time with an unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. Elaine glanced at it for a brief moment and then let it go to voicemail. She didn't need to answer. The past was finished, and the future was unfolding in front of her. She sat down on the couch with a deep sigh, allowing herself to relax fully for the first time in what felt like ages. Her phone buzzed again, this time a notification from the news app. Brad spotted at a local motel. Family fractured, sources say. Elaine raised an eyebrow at the headline. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or sad for him. The cracks in their family had been evident for years, but she had always held on to the hope that things would change. But the truth was, Brad had always been a passive observer in his own life, letting Jessica steer the ship. And now, that ship was sinking, leaving them both with no safety net. But Elaine had no obligation to hold on to the wreckage of their lives. Not anymore. By the time Marion finished arranging the final few items, the place felt like home. The newness of it all was refreshing, and the sense of space, a space that was entirely hers, was liberating. Elaine stood at the window, looking out over the city, the lights twinkling as night settled in. The condo was quiet now, the hum of traffic a soft background noise that made the space feel alive, not stifling. Her reflection in the glass looked different, stronger somehow. The woman she saw there wasn't the one who had stood in the basement, silenced and defeated. She wasn't the woman who had let herself be pushed around by Jessica and Brad. She was someone else now, someone who had taken control. No basements here, Elaine whispered to herself again, the words holding the weight of so much more than a physical space. Marion joined her by the window, smiling as she followed Elaine's gaze toward the city below. "You've got a new life now, Elaine," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've built something here, something real." Elaine nodded slowly. "Yes, a life on my own terms, and it feels damn good." As they stood together in the silence of the condo, Elaine's heart finally slowed. She could feel it now. The weight that had once crushed her was gone, replaced with the lightness of a fresh start. And in that moment, with the city lights twinkling outside, Elaine knew she was truly free. The news hit the town like a thunderclap. Within a week of their eviction, Jessica and Brad filed for bankruptcy. The small, tight-knit community buzzed with gossip, whispers behind closed doors, and sidelong glances over coffee cups. People who once exchanged pleasantries in passing now openly discussed how the Porters had crumbled. From the local bakery to the corner shop, no one seemed to be able to avoid the train wreck that was their fall from grace. Elaine had heard the murmurs, of course. She knew they would come. And yet, as she sat in her cozy condo, looking out over the city, a quiet satisfaction settled over her. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, but everything had fallen into place, just as it was supposed to. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about survival. Her survival. Jessica had tried to reach out again, her number blocked, her messages ignored. The calls became more frantic, her tone turning bitter, but nothing would change. Elaine had made her decision. Her future was no longer tied to them. It wasn't about them anymore. Brad's face had appeared on the front page of the local paper, a stark reminder of his and Jessica's downfall. The headline was, "Blunt," a simple phrase that couldn't capture the complexity of what had truly happened. "Local family files for bankruptcy after eviction." Beneath it, the photo of Brad standing on the steps of the motel, looking disheveled and lost, was a symbol of his passive nature, always in the background, always watching but never taking control. Elaine didn't feel sorry for him. She didn't feel anything, really. The cracks had been evident for years, and she had tried to support him when he was willing to fight for what was his. But he never fought. And now, all that was left were the consequences of his inaction. Jessica, however, was a different story. Elaine had watched her daughter spiral. The fire of entitlement that had once burned so brightly was now a smoldering ember, fading quickly. Elaine could imagine Jessica, huddled in some dark corner of their old house, sobbing over what was lost, over the life she had believed was her birthright. Elaine had heard Jessica's words echo in her mind more than once. "You ruined us." But Elaine didn't believe it. Jessica had done this to herself. She had ignored every warning, every chance for redemption. Now, she would have to face the consequences. Back at her condo, Elaine felt the weight of her decisions in the best possible way. The house had been sold, the sale finalized, and now she was free. She sat down at the small desk by the window, the view of the city below like a reminder of everything she had fought for. With a few swift movements, she accessed her online bank account and transferred the proceeds from the sale into her retirement investments. The numbers on the screen were large, more than enough to secure her future, but it wasn't about the money. It was about independence. It was about reclaiming her life. She had taken the first step, and now she had the security to move forward. Marion had been right by her side throughout the entire process. She had been her anchor, her guiding hand. It wasn't just about the sale or the new condo. It was about rebuilding, piece by piece. Marion had known, even before Elaine had, that this was always the way it would end. She had always said it with a grin, that wry smile that hinted at a deeper understanding. "She gave you a basement," Marion would joke, "and you gave her a bottomless pit." Elaine had laughed every time, but there was truth in the statement. What Jessica had built was hollow, a house of cards that had come crashing down. Elaine's victory wasn't in the house. It was in the way she had taken her power back. She had come through the fire, unscathed, and emerged stronger. Dean had been in touch, finalizing the last of the paperwork. The legal battle was over. The contracts were signed, and now it was just a matter of waiting for the final paperwork to be filed. "We're closing the last case," Dean had said, his voice warm with approval. "Everything's wrapped up." Elaine didn't need to hear more. It was done. She was done. As the days passed, Elaine found herself in a quiet peace she hadn't experienced in years. The weight of Jessica's control, Brad's apathy, was gone. They were fragments of her past now, nothing more than a distant memory. Elaine had moved on. She stood at the window, looking out over the city that now belonged to her. The lights twinkled in the distance, as if the city itself were reflecting her own inner light. The past was behind her, but the future, for the first time, felt limitless. The woman she had been, the woman who had endured years of manipulation and neglect, was no more. This new life, this freedom, was hers, and nothing, not even Jessica or Brad, could take that away. Jessica's new life felt like a never-ending cycle of exhaustion. Every morning she dragged herself out of bed, the weight of her new reality settling in her chest like an iron anchor. The small retail store where she worked was hardly glamorous, a far cry from the life she had imagined. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she folded shirts for the 100th time that day, the monotony stretching on endlessly. The customers were indifferent, the hours long, and the pay barely enough to cover rent and groceries. The dreams of luxury and entitlement she once harbored were long gone, replaced by the harsh reality of living paycheck to paycheck. She was tired, physically, mentally, and emotionally drained. Her hands ached from hours of folding and restocking, and her back constantly throbbed from standing all day. But what hit hardest was the internal exhaustion, the feeling that she had let everything slip through her fingers. Jessica couldn't help but think about the house, about the life she had lost. She still couldn't wrap her mind around how things had gone so wrong. She had never imagined this, never thought she would find herself wearing a worn apron, scanning items at a counter for strangers who barely acknowledged her existence. She had been too focused on control, on making everything hers. Now, there was nothing left to cling to but a few broken dreams. Meanwhile, Brad's life seemed to drift in the same endless current of aimlessness. He had yet to find a new job, and the days blended together as he shuffled between the couch and the small motel room they were renting. He'd had his own moments of panic, but the lack of structure in his life had lulled him into a strange apathy. He was out of work, yes, but he wasn't doing anything to change it. He didn't seem to care enough to try. The reality of being on his own, without the support of Jessica's family or the comfort of the house, was too much for him to confront. When Elaine heard the news about Brad, about how he had spent the past few weeks floating through life without purpose. She wasn't surprised. She knew he had never really wanted anything more than to sit back and let Jessica handle everything. But now that Jessica's world had crumbled, so had Brad's. It was a few weeks later when Elaine ran into Jessica at the grocery store. She hadn't seen her daughter since the day the house was sold, and part of her was curious about how Jessica had been coping. The moment she walked down the aisle, Elaine spotted her. Jessica was standing by the shelves, scanning the labels of canned goods, her uniform still on, dirty apron and all. Elaine hesitated for a moment, but something inside her told her to keep walking, to take this moment for what it was. So, she moved forward, her steps steady but cautious. When Jessica saw her, her face immediately paled. She froze for a moment, her eyes darting toward Elaine, but she quickly looked away, focusing on the cans in front of her. Elaine stopped a few feet away, watching her daughter in silence. The weight of the years between them pressed down on her like a storm cloud, but she didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. The silence said more than any words could. Jessica finally spoke, her voice shaky and tight. "What do you want, Mom?" Elaine's lips tightened. "I'm not here for anything. I just wanted to see how you were doing." Jessica's eyes flickered with something. Resentment? Maybe shame. But she still wouldn't meet her mother's gaze. Instead, she focused on her hands, fiddling with the edge of the shelf. "I'm fine," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Elaine's heart twisted in her chest, but she held her ground. "It doesn't have to be like this, Jessica. You could still turn things around." Jessica's laugh was bitter, empty. "You think I haven't tried? What do you expect me to do? Everything's falling apart." Her voice cracked, but she quickly wiped the emotion away, looking anywhere but at Elaine. "I don't have the luxury of making things right like you did." Elaine felt the familiar sting of old wounds, wounds she had thought were healed. But instead of letting them fester, she simply nodded. "I don't have the answers, but I know you'll figure it out." "You're strong, Jessica." Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line, and she finally met her mother's gaze, but only briefly. The words hung in the air, unspoken, but heavy with meaning. Then, as quickly as she had looked up, Jessica lowered her eyes again, the conversation ending as abruptly as it had begun. Elaine turned to leave, but not without a final glance back. Jessica stood frozen in place, her back hunched, as if the weight of everything was too much to carry. Later that afternoon, Elaine sat in the warmth of her cozy condo, a steaming cup of tea in hand, the faint hum of the city outside her window. The moment of confrontation with Jessica had unsettled her, but she wasn't surprised by the coldness between them. They had spent too many years in a one-sided relationship, and no amount of time or apologies could change that now. Marian had come over, bringing a fresh pie to celebrate Elaine's newfound peace. They sat at the small dining table, laughing over the sweet scent of apples and cinnamon. The world outside felt distant and irrelevant for a moment. Elaine had her own life now, one where she wasn't constantly bending to others' expectations. She smiled, wiping a stray crumb from her mouth. "It feels like home, doesn't it?" Marian nodded, her eyes twinkling. "A real home. No more basements." Elaine sighed, feeling a deep sense of contentment wash over her. The door had closed on one life, but another had opened, one full of promise, freedom, and the possibility of building something real, just for herself. The future, at last, felt bright, and no one could take that from her. The room was filled with the hum of quiet conversation, the scent of coffee and pastries lingering in the air as Elaine stood at the podium. The senior center was warm, welcoming, and familiar, a place where stories were shared and experiences were celebrated. But today, the room felt different to her. Today, she wasn't just another face among the crowd. Today, she was about to share her own story. Elaine's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. Her gaze swept across the room, where the attendees sat in a sea of expectant faces, some older than her, some younger, but all of them here for a reason. They were looking for something. Inspiration, maybe. A spark. She had been given that chance to inspire, and for the first time in her life, she felt ready to speak. Marian sat at the back, holding her phone, recording the moment with a quiet pride. She'd been with Elaine through all of this, the messy, painful unraveling of a life that had once felt impossible to break free from. But now, here they were, at the culmination of it all, watching as Elaine stood tall, the weight of her past behind her and the future gleaming with possibility. Elaine took a deep breath and began. I stand here today, not as a victim, but as someone who has fought to claim her own life, she said, her voice strong and steady. I want you all to hear me when I say this. Own your deeds, own your life. The words came out clearly, resonating through the room. She could feel the weight of them settling like a truth that had been waiting to be said. You see, she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, we all face moments where we feel trapped. We all feel like we're stuck in a basement of some kind. It could be a basement of our own making, of fear, of regret, of dependence. It could be a basement that someone else puts us in, tells us we belong in. But the truth is, she paused, her heart thundering in her chest. Basements aren't prisons unless you let them be. She let the words hang in the air, watching the subtle shift in the faces of the crowd. Some people shifted in their seats, others nodded slightly, and a few even wiped away silent tears. Elaine didn't feel the need to rush. She let her words settle, to sink in deep, as the weight of her journey, her decision to free herself from the suffocating control of her past, echoed in every corner of the room. She glanced at Marian, who beamed at her from the back of the room. Elaine could see the pride in her friend's eyes, but there was more than that. A recognition of how far Elaine had come, how much strength she had gained. She wasn't just talking about surviving, she was talking about living, and that was something Jessica would never understand. I've spent a lifetime in a basement, metaphorically speaking. I've spent years being told what to do, how to act, who to be. But when I finally looked at my life, truly looked at it, I realized something. The only one who could unlock that door was me. The only one who could climb out of that basement was me. And I did. The room was silent now, everyone leaning in, hanging on her words. Elaine's chest swelled with a quiet sense of triumph. She wasn't here to fight anymore. She wasn't here to be silenced or overlooked. She was here to be heard, and they were listening. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound heroic. I'm telling you this because I want you to know that you can do it too. You can take control of your life, no matter where you are, no matter how old you are. You don't have to stay in that basement any longer. A round of applause broke out across the room, gentle at first, but growing stronger with each beat. Elaine felt the warmth of it wash over her, and for the first time in years, she felt like she had finally found her place, right here, right now. As the applause died down, several people came forward, one by one, to thank Elaine. Some were moved to tears, others simply offered a quiet, steady handshake. Each person's gratitude was a small, private affirmation of the power of her words, the power of her courage. Marian made her way to the front after the crowd had cleared. She squeezed Elaine's shoulder with a proud grin. You did it, she said softly, her voice filled with admiration. Elaine smiled, but her eyes were still distant, her mind replaying the words she had just said. I finally said what needed to be said. Marian's phone buzzed. You've got a feature in the local paper, she said, showing Elaine the headline that popped up. Local woman overcomes struggles, shares her story with Senior Center. Elaine let out a small laugh. I guess it's not just my life that's changed, huh? No, Marian said, her grin widening. The whole community is listening now. Elaine took a breath, the weight of the moment not lost on her. The woman who had once been silenced, who had once been shoved into a basement of her own making, was now a woman with a voice, with a future that she could call her own. As they walked out into the parking lot, the evening air cool against their skin, Elaine felt that familiar peace wash over her once more. She was free. And this time, she was never going back. Elaine sat at her desk, staring at the blank screen in front of her. The numbers from the sale of the house were there, quietly waiting for her to take action. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her, an opportunity to create something that would transcend her personal freedom. She had already rebuilt her life, but now she could give something back, something lasting. It took a few moments before her fingers finally moved across the keyboard, filling out the online forms, setting up the fund, the scholarship fund. It was a small, simple idea, one that had taken root in her heart the moment she realized what she wanted her legacy to. She didn't need the money, her new condo, the investments, everything she'd fought for. She was secure, independent, but she had watched so many women struggle, especially those who had been in the same position she had once been, who hadn't had the luxury of choice. Single mothers, fighting against the odds to provide a future for their children, with little support and fewer opportunities. That's what the scholarship fund would be for. To provide those women with the resources they needed to escape the cycle they were trapped in, just as she had. Education, mentorship, the chance to build a better future, not for her own gain, but for those who deserved a chance she'd once fought to get for herself. She filled out the last of the details and hit submit, the form confirming the fund's creation on the screen in front of her. A deep sense of purpose filled her chest. This was what she had been meant to do. Make sure others didn't have to crawl through the basement the way she had. A few weeks later, the community gathered for a small ceremony at the local community center. Elaine stood at the podium, looking out at the faces in the crowd. Neighbors, friends, and strangers, people who had heard about her story, her triumph. Some came out of curiosity, others out of genuine admiration. The local paper had published a feature about her scholarship fund, and the response had been overwhelming. The room was warm with applause as Elaine accepted a plaque from the mayor, a token of the community's recognition for her contributions. Her face flushed with a quiet humility, but inside, she was bursting with pride. This was more than just a gesture of kindness. It was proof that her struggle hadn't been in vain. The applause died down, and Elaine's voice echoed through the small hall. This fund is for the women who are still fighting, still trying to claw their way out of their own basement, she said, her voice steady, yet filled with emotion. Better to build futures than fund their basements. The words resonated, each one a reminder of the journey she had taken, of what it meant to build something solid, something that would last, something that mattered. As she stepped down from the podium, the crowd gathered around her to offer their thanks, their praise. Elaine smiled, accepting each handshake, each word of gratitude with grace. But none of it compared to the quiet peace she felt knowing that this was her legacy. Back at her condo, Elaine sat on the balcony with a glass of wine in hand, gazing out at the city below. The sunset painted the sky with shades of pink and gold, a perfect reflection of the life she had created. Marion joined her, settling into the chair beside her. "You did it," Marion said, her voice thick with pride. "You rewrote your ending, Elaine." Elaine's smile softened as she turned to her friend. "I had to. I couldn't leave it like that. Not after everything." Marion clinked her glass with Elaine. "This is just the beginning. You've given so much already." Elaine gazed out at the city, her heart full. "It's not just about the money," she said, her voice distant yet content. "It's about showing them that they can climb out, that there is another way." Marion leaned back, her expression a mixture of admiration and affection. "You're a force, you know that?" Elaine chuckled softly. "Maybe, but I wasn't always. I had to learn how to be one." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last of the sun dip below the horizon. There was a feeling of finality in the air, a deep sense of peace, of everything falling into place. Elsewhere, Jessica's life continued to spiral. She'd tried to pick up the pieces, but the foundation had cracked too deeply. Her job at the retail store barely kept her afloat. She had become a shadow of the woman she once was, the woman who thought the world owed her everything. Every failed attempt to turn things around only added to her bitterness, her resentment growing like a wildfire that could not be extinguished. In the small town, she had become a whisper, a name that was rarely spoken, and when it was always in the context of failure. Elaine knew this. She heard it in passing, saw it in the local paper, but she didn't feel sorry for Jessica. She had given her every opportunity to choose differently, and Jessica had ignored them all. Brad, on the other hand, had left town entirely. The quiet resignation of his life had pushed him out, as if he had finally accepted that there was nothing for him here anymore. He had disappeared, leaving behind only the remnants of the life he'd taken for granted. Elaine's life, however, was just beginning. Her future was hers to write. She had built something real, something that would matter long after she was gone. Her gaze turned back to the city skyline, the lights flickering like a constellation of possibilities. The story of her life wasn't over. It had only just begun, and for the first time, she was ready to live it fully. Elaine's new condo had transformed into a home filled with warmth, laughter, and a sense of purpose she had never known before. The place had been hers for months now, and each day it felt more permanent. The living room, once bare and silent, was now adorned with bookshelves filled with carefully chosen novels, each one a piece of her growing independence. A large window offered sweeping views of the city below, and every morning she woke to the quiet hum of the world, her world, coming to life. On this particular evening, the space felt especially vibrant. A group of women, some of them her age, others much younger, had gathered for the monthly book club meeting she had started. What had begun as a casual gathering between a few friends had blossomed into something much larger. Word of her story had spread, and now she welcomed women from all walks of life into her home, sharing stories, ideas, and, most importantly, a sense of community. The conversation was animated as they discussed the latest book, but it wasn't the book itself that made Elaine smile. It was the connection, the sense that she was finally part of something meaningful. The women, from various stages in life, had come to her, not just for the book discussion, but for the inspiration she had unknowingly offered them. "You really make us feel like we're not alone," one of the younger women said, her voice sincere. "You give us hope that we can be more than what others expect of us." Elaine felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet pride in knowing that her story, her choices, were now a beacon for others. She had become something she had never expected, a role model. But more than that, she had become a woman who lived authentically, without fear of judgment, without apology for her past. As the evening wound down and the guests began to trickle out, Marian lingered, her eyes twinkling with that familiar spark of pride. She was watching her friend, her best friend, flourish in a way that, a year ago, seemed impossible. They had both been through so much, but now Elaine was standing taller than ever before. "You're doing it, Elaine," Marian said softly, her voice full of affection. "You've really built something here." Elaine smiled, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. "I didn't think I would, but it feels right. This is where I'm supposed to be." A few weeks later, Elaine was at the podium again, this time for a ceremony in her honor. The local community center had organized a small event to celebrate her work with the scholarship fund and the book club. The room was full, not just with neighbors, but with a sense of respect she had never expected to receive. She was being recognized, not for her wealth or success, but for the quiet courage she had shown in rebuilding her life. Marian beamed from the front row, a silent cheerleader who had stood by Elaine through every step of her journey. When the mayor called her up to accept the recognition, Elaine's heart fluttered. She wasn't used to the attention, but it was different now. She had earned this, every bit of it. "You've been a beacon of hope to so many," the mayor said, his words echoing in the room. "Your work with the scholarship fund has changed lives, and the strength you've shown is an inspiration to us all." The applause was thunderous, and Elaine's cheeks flushed with warmth. But this time, the applause didn't make her uncomfortable. It felt deserved. It felt like a natural consequence of the work she had done, of the woman she had become. As she returned to her seat, Dean, her attorney, approached quietly. He had been with her from the beginning, helping her navigate the legalities of selling the house, setting up the fund, and securing her future. He shook her hand and smiled with quiet approval. "Cleanest revenge I've seen," he murmured with a chuckle, his voice low enough that only Elaine could hear. He nodded toward the crowd, where Jessica's name had never been mentioned, not once. "You didn't just reclaim your life, Elaine. You built a legacy." Elaine's eyes flickered with a brief, knowing smile. "I didn't raise her for greed, Dean," she replied softly, her voice steady and unshaken, "but I ended her greed." That evening, as the ceremony wound down, Elaine sat back at her condo, the quiet hum of the city outside her window. The weight of everything she had accomplished seemed to finally settle, the satisfaction in her chest as real and full as the world she had worked so hard to create. She was a woman who had taken control, who had walked through the fire and emerged stronger. And somewhere, far away, Jessica's name remained a distant echo, whispered only in judgment and regret. The life she had fought for, built on lies, on entitlement, had unraveled. And now, there was only silence where once there had been her demands. Elaine didn't feel anger anymore. She didn't even feel bitterness. She had learned that the only way forward was through release. Jessica, Brad, and the past. They were no longer her concern. The legacy Elaine had built wasn't about revenge, it was about strength, about giving back to those who needed it, about providing opportunities to those who had never been afforded them. Marion came to stand beside her, the two of them watching the city lights twinkle like 1,000 stars outside the window. "You know," Marion said, her voice soft, "they never saw you coming, did they?" Elaine chuckled. "Number. But I'm here now." And as she gazed out at the city, the future, full of possibility, stretched before her. Her name was no longer one that people whispered about in shame. It was a name that stood for resilience, for grace, for the power of reclaiming one's life. And this time, she had made sure the future was hers, not just to live, but to build. The evening light had softened into a golden hue as Elaine sat on the balcony of her condo, the quiet hum of the city below almost drowned out by the wind in the trees. The mountain view in the distance seemed to stretch on forever, framed by the crisp, cool air that swept through the open door. Marion sat beside her, sipping her tea, the comfortable silence between them one they had shared many times before. Elaine's fingers curled around her own warm cup, the gentle weight of it grounding her. She had come a long way from the woman who had been trapped in the basement, from the woman who had spent years shrinking to make space for the people who had tried to take everything from her. Now, she had everything she needed, and it wasn't just in her bank account. It was in the quiet peace she felt every day, in the space she had created for herself, where there were no demands, no manipulations, no basements to hide in. The soft ding of her phone interrupted the stillness. She glanced down to see the notification from her bank app. She unlocked it quickly, her eyes scanning the screen. The numbers were solid, growing, investments doing well. The balance in her accounts was secure, more than secure. It was steady, growing slowly and steadily, just like her life had. The future wasn't a question anymore. It was a promise she had built for herself. She exhaled slowly, a soft smile curling on her lips. This was what freedom felt like. Not the flash of a sale or the sting of a closed door. This was the long, quiet contentment of knowing that nothing could take this from her. Marion glanced over, catching the peaceful look on Elaine's face. "Everything you've worked for is right here," she said, her voice full of quiet pride. Elaine nodded, her gaze returning to the mountains in the distance. "It's not just about money," she said softly. "It's about the freedom to decide, freedom to build what I want, not what anyone else expected of me." Marion raised her cup to her lips, her eyes twinkling in the fading light. "And no basements." Elaine chuckled, her smile widening. The words, light and playful, held more truth than she could have imagined just a year ago. No more hiding, no more cramped spaces, no more being made to feel small. "No basements," she echoed, the peace in her voice reflecting the truth of her journey. The world around her seemed to settle into a quiet hum, the mountains in the distance stretching out under the now darkening sky. The city, so full of life, had become a backdrop to the life Elaine had built. Her future was bright, glowing with possibilities. The next day, the local paper ran a feature on Elaine. The headline read, "Local woman overcomes adversity, finds peace and independence." There were photos of her from the recent ceremony, her smile radiant and genuine. The article spoke of the scholarship fund she had created, of the book club that had blossomed under her leadership, and of the quiet strength she had shown in the face of adversity. Elaine glanced at the piece, her fingers gently brushing the corner of the paper. The article was exactly as she had hoped, focused on the future, not the past. There was no mention of the house she had sold, no mention of Jessica or Brad, just the quiet triumph of a woman who had rebuilt her life on her own terms. As she read, a sense of gratitude settled over her. This was what she had worked for. Not recognition, but the knowledge that she had made a difference, that she had taken everything the world had tried to break her with and turned it into something lasting. She set the paper down on the table beside her, her gaze drifting back to the view outside. Her condo, her life, the city. It was all hers. Nothing could take that from her. Later that evening, as the sun began to set once more, Elaine sat in the same spot on her balcony, the tea in her hands now cool, her mind calm. Marion was sitting beside her again, a familiar presence in the peace Elaine had built. They didn't speak. The silence comfortable, the kind that only deep friendship could create. Elaine thought about her journey, how far she had come. She thought about Jessica too, but there was no bitterness in her heart anymore. The house, the struggle, the pain, it was all behind her now. She had made her choice, and she had chosen herself. The finality of it all settled in, not with sharpness, but with soft relief. She had locked that door and never looked back. Her life, her future, was her own now, and no one, not even the ghosts of her past, could take that away from her. Elaine leaned back in her chair, the faint breeze tugging at her hair. Her gaze moved once more to the horizon, to the mountains in the distance. She could see everything clearly now. The future wasn't just ahead of her. It was here, in her hands, in her life. Her daughter had shoved her into the basement once, but Elaine had quietly sold the house above her head. And now, she was free. My daughter shoved me into the basement, so I quietly sold the house above her head.